They will not escape the defects common to the use of the political mechanism, wherever it is used. Again, let me emphasize, I am a limited government libertarian, not an anarchist libertarian, though I have a great deal of sympathy for the anarchist libertarian, including the fact that my son is one. But, you know, I have no prejudice against them. Some of my best friends are. But the role that I would assign to the government, where I think we need to have a government, is not in these areas of using resources for these purposes. It's in the area of law and defending the country, providing law and order, and helping us determine the rules under which we operate, adjudicating disputes, a very limited range. And as we all recognize, one of the major harms which is being done by the broader extension of governmental activity is that it prevents government from doing those things which I believe only it can do effectively. When people talk about the innocent victims of the war on drugs, they very often forget the people who suffer robberies, theft, murder, not because they get caught in crossfires, not because they're in drug wars, not because of addicts who are trying to support their habits, but simply because all of the police and the enforcement officers are being used to try to control drugs, and there aren't enough people, there aren't enough resources left to maintain, to prevent theft and burglary and arrest in the rest of the community. The second lesson I think we should learn, and probably the more important one, is that we are likely to make more progress on the against the war on drugs if we recognize its link to this broader problem of cutting down the scope and power of the government and restoring power to the people. If we treat it all by itself as an isolated instance, maybe there'll be success as there ultimately was in the case of prohibition in the 1920s. But I think our chances of success are greater if we recognize that it's part of a much broader problem. That the same reasons for eliminating the war on drugs are reasons for eliminating the socialization of medicine, the socialization of schools, and so on down the list. Thank you.
Neglected to mention in my short introduction that Professor Friedman is the 1991 recipient of the Richard J. Dennis Drug Peace Award for outstanding achievement in the field of drug policy reform, which will be presented this evening at our award banquet by drug policy. I suggest you send your questions up, by the way. I have a few, and if you have questions, please send them up. You can bring them right over here, Kevin. I have a two-part question. One from the floor and one with a bit of my own amendment. I'm allowed to do that. Should every produced good be subject to a free market? And the second part of the question was, if I look back at Adam Smith, and once with great foreboding I read the book, I think Adam Smith accepted the idea of, as you say, a limited role of government, including the administration of justice, and I think the phrase was the common defense. Many drug warriors would claim that because of the unique nature of drugs, they fit properly within the administration of justice and the common defense.
On the first half of the question, I do not believe that all items of production ought to be subject to this. I believe there is a case for keeping out of the market certain things. I don't believe it's highly desirable to have a market on atomic bombs. But the number and the list of things for which you can really justify a prohibition is very limited. And the main argument in most of these cases is the only justification is always in terms of the existence of innocent victims. In the case of drugs, the the major effect of drug prohibition is to multiply the number of innocent victims, not to reduce it. And that's why I don't think that any general rule you might have, there are some products which should not be traded in the market, such as atomic bombs, nitrogen bombs, and things like that, that apply to the case of drugs. Now, on the second question, I don't believe if Adam Smith were here today, he would agree with that interpretation of his restrictions. The reason why the prohibition of drugs is not a case of the administration of justice is because the drug user, whether he's smart or foolish or not, harms primarily himself. Now, there is a case for doing something in which the drug user harms other people, and we do. The case of alcohol is very simple. The driver is a person who drives when he's drunk. There is an argument, clearly should be prosecuted for that. It's the act of driving while drunk, not the act of drinking, for which he should be prosecuted. And similarly, if people under the influence of drugs do a similar thing, the act of doing that thing is what should be prosecuted, not the ingestion of the drugs. See, I think there are two arguments, as I've always argued, for drug prohibition. One is from principle, that people ought to be responsible for themselves, and the government has no business telling me what to ingest. This is, I'm sure, the argument too. I'm sure this is the argument you heard very effectively from Dr. Suss. But there's also the question of expedience. The question, for a moment, waive the question of principle. Are you doing more harm than good? And there, the evidence seems to be so overwhelming that it produces, that it appeals to people who will not join you on matters of principle. I'll give you some examples. My fundamental bias toward this initially developed out of the principle. My good friend Bill Buckley was initially in favor of drug prohibition. In fact, my son David once wrote an article attacking Bill's views on prohibition under the title, "Is Bill Buckley a Communicable Disease?" The reason being that Bill had argued in favor of drug prohibition on the ground that one drug user would communicate to another and infect them. And David said in his piece, well, Bill's ideas infect others. In fact, if you take that to an extreme case, I don't think this was his example, it's mine. Karl Marx's Capitalism and Freedom killed far more people. Karl Marx, what a brilliant said. Karl Marx's Capital surely has ended up killing more people than all the people that have ever been killed by alcohol, cigarettes, and tobacco, and drugs combined. But our principles of free speech says people ought to be free to read. And that was what he meant by his Bill Buckley communicable disease. Well, Bill has switched, and he is now a very strong proponent of drug legalization. Not on the grounds of principle, but on the grounds of expediency, on the grounds that the effort has failed and ought to be terminated. It's done far more harm than good, and there is no way of modifying it to make it just good. So I don't believe there's any way in which you can say that the prohibition of drugs is administering justice. Justice to whom? Is it justice to the people in Colombia who are being murdered because we can't enforce our own laws? That's hardly justice.
I wasn't saying that. I was wondering if that was
No, I don't think I was. Adam Smith was a very, very great man, a very smart man.
There's a series of questions here. I'm going to put them together. You supported Ronald Reagan.
Yes.
This says you supported Pinochet, or advised Pinochet.
I never advised Pinochet. I never supported Pinochet.
We'll throw that one away.
But, hold on. No, I don't want to evade the question.
All right.
Chile was a case in which a military regime, headed by Pinochet, was willing to switch the organization of the economy from a top-down to a bottom-up performance. And in that process, a group of trade at the University of Chicago in the Department of Economics, who came to be called the Chicago Board, played a major role in designing and implementing the economic